Chapter 6. Storm Breaking. 2 days after Lily's departure, I still couldn't bring myself to enter the Jensen house. Each time I passed it on my way to the schoolhouse, the sight of its darkened windows and silent porch sent a fresh wave of grief washing over me. The world had continued turning despite the gaping hole in my heart. Children still needed teaching, papers still needed grading, and the spring pageant still needed preparation. It was the latter errand that brought me to Abernathy's General Store on a blustery Thursday afternoon. The store offered momentary respite from the raw March wind that had been blowing since dawn, harbinger of the spring storms that regularly swept across the territory this time of year. I breathed in the familiar scents of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples as I made my way to the bolt fabrics at the rear of the store, determined to focus on selecting materials for the shepherd's costumes rather than on the small memory of Lily that lurked in every corner of Timber Creek. Mrs. Abernathy, mercifully, was occupied with a customer at the counter, a traveling salesman judging by his sample case and city clothes. Her usual torrent of questions and concerned glances had become nearly unbearable since Jed's abrupt departure and Lily's removal to St. Louis. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if I would crumble under this second abandonment. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Though my nights were spent in tears, my days were a model of composed efficiency. If the children noticed my reddened eyes or occasional lapses in attention, they were kind enough not to mention it. I ran my fingers over a bolt of rough brown wool, calculating how many yards I would need, when Mrs. Abernathy's voice rose in excitement, catching my attention. Well, I never! To think they were in our very town, sat right there in that chair, bold as brass, taking tea with the pastor's wife. Passed through Sweetwater last month, they did, the salesman replied, his nasal voice carrying clearly in the quiet store. Claimed they were seeking their orphaned nephew there. Strange coincidence, ain't it? Same story, different town, different child. I froze, my hand still resting on the fabric, every sense suddenly alert. The very same couple? Mrs. Abernathy pressed. You're certain? Couldn't say for absolute sure, ma'am, not having seen them myself, the salesman hedged. But the description matches right enough. Elegant Eastern couple, well-spoken gentleman with dark hair going silver at the temples, blonde lady with a fur-trimmed traveling coat. Called themselves Harrington in Sweetwater, too, according to Widow Jenkins, who runs the boarding house there. Said they were looking for their sister's boy. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the drafty store. In my mind, I saw Victoria Harrington reaching for Lily, the awkward way she'd held her despite claiming a maternal sister's bond. I recalled Edward's vague answers about Sarah's childhood when Pastor Wells had innocently inquired after dinner that night. At the time, I'd attributed their reticence to the pain of estrangement. But now, and did they find this nephew? I asked, stepping forward before I could think better of it. The salesman and Mrs. Abernathy turned, surprised by my sudden appearance from behind the fabric shelves. The salesman removed his hat, revealing thinning hair slicked with macassar oil. Begging your pardon, miss. Didn't see you there. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. No, they didn't. Seems the child they described didn't exist in Sweetwater. Sheriff there got suspicious, asked some pointed questions, and they left town sudden like the next morning. The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet as the implications settled over me. If they had tried the same scheme in Sweetwater, if they had lied about their purpose there... The Harringtons took Lily east 2 days ago. Mrs. Abernathy explained to the salesman, her usually rosy face gone pale. Said they were her aunt and uncle? Had papers and everything. Didn't they, Miss Holloway? Yes, I managed, thinking of the documents Sheriff Taylor had examined. Letters from Sarah, a birth certificate, authorization from a territorial judge. Which judge might that be? The salesman asked, setting down his coffee cup with renewed interest. Only I heard tell Judge Wilson in Laramie caught some slick forgers last fall passing false documents. Been keeping an eye out for similar work since. Judge William Hanson, I said, the name rising easily from memory. I'd stared at that signature for long minutes in the sheriff's office, willing it to be somehow invalid. The salesman's bushy eyebrows shot up. Hanson? From the Eastern District? When I nodded, he shook his head slowly. Miss, I hate to be the bearer of ill news, but Judge Hanson died of apoplexy 6 months ago. His replacement hasn't even been confirmed by the territorial governor yet. The last of my doubts evaporated, replaced by a cold certainty that squeezed the air from my lungs. I have to go, I said abruptly, abandoning my shopping basket on the nearest counter. Mrs. Abernathy, please tell the children's school is dismissed for the afternoon if I'm not back in time. Without waiting for a response, I gathered my skirts and hurried out into the biting wind, my heart pounding with fear and a desperate, burgeoning hope. If the Harringtons were imposters, if their documents were forgeries, then Lily had been taken under false pretenses. She wasn't bound for a life of privilege in St. Louis. She was in the hands of strangers with unknown intentions. And somewhere in his isolated cabin, unaware of this terrible discovery, was the one person who loved her as much as I did. Sheriff Taylor's office was warm after the chill outdoors, but I barely noticed as I burst through the door without knocking. The sheriff looked up from his desk, startled by my uncharacteristic entrance. Miss Holloway, what in tarnation? The Harringtons are frauds, I interrupted, the words tumbling out in a rush. They aren't Lily's relatives. They've done this before, in Sweetwater at least, possibly elsewhere. The sheriff rose slowly, his weathered face creasing in concern. Those are serious accusations, Miss Holloway. Perhaps you should sit down and explain. I remained standing, too agitated for the civility of a chair. Instead, I relayed everything I'd overheard at the general store, watching as the sheriff's expression shifted from skepticism to growing alarm. And the judge who supposedly authorized their custody claim, I finished, has been dead for 6 months, according to the salesman. Sheriff Taylor rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. That's concerning, if true, but it could be a misunderstanding. This salesman might have his facts wrong. Or he might not, I countered, frustration mounting at his measured response. Sheriff, we handed Lily over to complete strangers on the basis of documents that may well be forgeries. Doesn't that warrant investigation? He sighed heavily, reaching for his hat. You're right, of course. Come with me to the telegraph office. We'll send inquiries to Sweetwater and the other major settlements. If there's a pattern here, we'll find it. The wind had picked up as we crossed the street to the small building that housed Timber Creek's telegraph and postal service. Inside, young Jimmy Fletcher sat behind the counter, idly whittling a piece of pine while awaiting messages. He straightened immediately at the sight of the sheriff. Need to send some urgent wires, Jimmy, Sheriff Taylor said, reaching for a pencil and telegraph form. To Sweetwater, Laramie, Cheyenne, and Fort Bridger. I watched anxiously as he composed a brief message inquiring about a couple matching the Harringtons' description who might have attempted to claim orphan children using judicial documents. When the last telegram had been sent, the sheriff turned to me with forced optimism. Now we wait. Shouldn't be long for Sweetwater to respond, being closest. The others might take until tomorrow, depending on conditions. And if your suspicions are confirmed, I pressed, what then? The sheriff's expression turned grim. Then we organize a posse and go after them. The eastbound stage route is well established. If we move quickly, we might catch them before they reach the railroad at Cheyenne. The next few hours passed with excruciating slowness. I paced the small confines of the telegraph office, unable to return to the schoolhouse or my cottage while Lily's fate hung in the balance. Outside, the sky darkened ominously, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the windows. Spring storm coming, Jimmy observed, glancing up from his telegraph key. Been listening to reports all morning. Laramie says the creek's already rising at Miller's Crossing. As if in response to his words, the telegraph began to click. Jimmy grabbed his pencil, transcribing the incoming message with practiced efficiency. When it was complete, he handed the paper to Sheriff Taylor, who read it with a deepening frown. Sweetwater confirms, he said, passing me the telegram. A couple matching our description attempted to claim an orphaned boy there last month, fled when questioned. Sheriff there says they presented documents bearing Judge Hanson's signature as well. My hands trembled as I read the confirmation of my worst fears. Before I could respond, the telegraph clattered again. This time the message came from Laramie, reporting a similar incident 3 weeks prior. By late afternoon, we had received responses from all 4 settlements, each confirming encounters with the elegant, well-spoken couple who sought orphaned children using forged documentation. Child traffickers, Sheriff Taylor said flatly, collecting the telegrams into a grim stack. They find orphaned children in remote settlements, forge documents claiming relation, then vanish with them. God only knows what becomes of the little ones after that. The horror of it, that we had handed sweet, innocent Lily to such people, made my knees buckle. I sank into the nearest chair, my mind racing to the worst possibilities. We have to go after them, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Every minute we delay— I know, the sheriff interrupted, already reaching for his coat. I'll round up a posse immediately. The stage left Tuesday morning. Even with delays, they'll be nearing Cheyenne by now. A flash of lightning illuminated the darkened office, followed seconds later by a tremendous crack of thunder. The spring storm had arrived in full force, rain now sheeting down the windows in silvery. Jimmy looked up from a new message with a grim expression. Sheriff, wire from Fort Bridger says the north branch of the Green is over its banks. Miller's Creek Bridge washed out an hour ago. The sheriff swore under his breath. That's the main route east, if that bridge is gone. Could they have crossed already? I asked, desperate for some hope to cling to. Possibly, Sheriff Taylor acknowledged. But if not, they'll be stranded on the wrong side until the waters recede. Either way, we can't follow directly. He pounded his fist on the counter in frustration. Damn this weather! Even if we find an alternate route, it will add days to the journey. Another crackle of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening thunderclap that shook the building to its foundations. Outside, the rain had become a deluge, turning the street into a river of mud. Jed needs to know, I said suddenly, the certainty cutting through my fear. He's the best tracker in the territory. If anyone can find an alternate route, it's him. Sheriff Taylor shook his head emphatically. Mackenzie's likely holed up in his cabin by now. No one reaches him in these conditions. The mountain trails would be suicide in this weather. I stared at the sheriff for a long moment, my resolve crystallizing into something harder than Wyoming granite. All my life I had been the sensible one, the careful one, the one who followed rules and maintained propriety. But for Lily, and yes, for Jed too, I would throw caution to the wind. I can, I said, my voice taking on a determination that surprised even me. I know the way to his cabin. I've been there before. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up in surprise at this revelation, but I offered no explanation. What mattered now was not propriety, but purpose. Miss Holloway, I cannot allow you to risk your life in this manner, he began, adopting his most authoritative tone. The trails would be washed out, visibility near zero, even experienced riders would think twice about attempting such a journey. I'm not asking your permission, Sheriff, I replied, gathering my sodden skirts as I rose to my feet. I'm informing you of my intentions. You organize your posse and find an alternate route. I'll bring Jed. Before he could offer further protest, I stepped into the howling storm, the wind immediately snatching my bonnet and sending it tumbling down the flooded street. I let it go, my mind already racing ahead to the preparations I would need to make before nightfall. Lily needed us. Both of us. And unlike 5 years ago, this time I wouldn't let Jed McKenzie walk away from those who loved him without a fight. Dawn broke reluctantly through banks of pewter clouds, the rain having subsided temporarily to a fine, penetrating mist that beaded on my woolen cloak and dripped steadily from the brim of the borrowed hat I wore. Sheriff Taylor's final warnings echoed in my mind as I urged my mare Penny up the increasingly treacherous mountain trail. 3 days, Miss Holloway, he'd said sternly as he helped secure my saddlebags. If you're not back in 3 days, I'm sending men after you, storm or no storm. I'd accepted his concern with outward gratitude, while privately doubting anyone would follow. The men would be occupied with their own attempts to pursue the Harringtons, and none knew the way to Jed's cabin as I did. I alone had been there once before, 5 years ago, when Jed had proudly shown me the remote homestead he was building for us. Before everything changed. Before he decided I deserved better than a broken soldier. Now I leaned forward in the saddle, patting Penny's sleek neck as she picked her way around a fallen pine that partially blocked the trail. Good girl, I murmured, the words snatched away by the damp wind. Not much farther now. In truth, I had no way of knowing how much distance remained. The familiar landmarks I remembered from that long-ago visit had been obscured by the storm, the ordinarily clear mountain streams now swollen to angry torrents that cut new paths down the slopes. Twice already we'd been forced to double back and seek alternate routes where the trail had been washed away entirely. My body ached from hours in the saddle, my skirts sodden and heavy despite the oilcloth riding skirt Mrs. Abernathy had pressed upon me before departure. I'd departed Timber Creek at first light, with provisions for 2 days, confident in my ability to reach Jed's cabin before nightfall. Now, with the watery sun already past its zenith, and the trail conditions deteriorating with each mile, that confidence seemed like foolish pride. Pride goeth before destruction, I whispered, recalling Sunday's sermon with grim humor, and a haughty spirit before a fall. As if summoned by the biblical warning, Penny suddenly stumbled, her front right leg plunging into a mud-concealed hole with a sickening sound. I clung to the saddle horn as she righted herself with a panicked whinny, but the damage was done. When she took her next step, the leg barely supported her weight. No, 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 I breathed, dismounting quickly to examine the injury. My gloved hands ran down her cannon bone, finding no obvious break, but the way she flinched at my gentle probing told me she wouldn't be carrying me any farther today. I glanced around at the unfamiliar terrain, trying to orient myself. The trail had widened slightly here, perhaps by hunters or trappers. Jed's cabin lay somewhere to the northwest, in a small clearing backed by a granite outcropping. But how far? I couldn't say with certainty. Sensible Clara Holloway, the prim schoolteacher who'd never taken an unnecessary risk in her life, would turn back now. She would lead her injured horse down the mountain and return when conditions improved. But that woman had ceased to exist the moment the Harringtons had taken Lily from us. "I'm sorry, old friend," I told Penny, loosening her saddle and removing it entirely. I secured the saddlebags across my own back, took the reins, and began to lead her forward at a slow pace that accommodated her limping gait. "We'll find shelter for you, I promise." For another hour we continued thus, the rain returning with renewed vigor as the afternoon waned. My sodden skirts wrapped around my legs like leaden weights, and my boots squelched with every step in the mud-slick trail. Penny followed gamely despite her injury, but her breathing had grown labored, and I knew we couldn't continue much longer. Providence arrived in the form of a crude lean-to set back from the trail, likely a hunter's shelter, abandoned for the season, but sound enough to provide some protection from the elements. After ensuring Penny was secured beneath its relative dryness, I left her with a measure of oats and the remaining water from my canteen. "I'll return for you," I promised, patting her neck one final time before turning to face the wilderness alone. Without Penny's warmth beside me, the cold intensified, seeping through my layers of wool and cotton to settle in my very bones. The weight of the saddlebags containing food, dry clothing, and my father's old revolver pulled at my shoulders as I pushed onward, using a sturdy branch as a walking stick on the increasingly steep terrain. By my reckoning, Jed's cabin couldn't be more than a few miles distant, though the gathering dusk and disorienting sameness of the pine forest made certainty impossible. I fixed my mind on the image of Lily in the hands of those deceivers, her trusting blue eyes and sweet smile driving me forward when my body screamed for rest. And if I were being entirely honest with myself, it wasn't only Lily who pulled me up this mountain through wind and rain. It was Jed himself, the man who had twice walked away believing himself unworthy of love. The stubborn, honorable fool who'd sooner live alone in pain than risk tainting others with his perceived darkness. "Not this time, Jedediah McKenzie," I muttered through chattering teeth. "This time, you don't get to decide alone." The last of the daylight faded as the trail grew indistinct, meandering between towering pines whose lowest branches whipped at my face and caught in my hair. Twice I lost my footing on hidden rocks, falling to my knees in mud so cold it burned against my skin. The second time, exhaustion nearly overwhelmed my resolve to rise again. When I finally acknowledged I was lost, darkness had fallen completely. The rain had intensified once more, driven sideways by a howling wind that disoriented me further with each gust. Panic fluttered at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it firmly away. Panic would not save Lily. Panic would not bring me to Jed. Ahead, barely visible through the curtain of rain, I spotted a rocky overhang that promised at least minimal shelter. I staggered toward it, the last of my strength ebbing with each step. The outcropping was shallow, but deep enough to block the worst of the wind and rain. I huddled against the cold stone, shivering violently as I searched my saddlebags for the dry clothing I'd packed. My fingers, numb and clumsy with cold, fumbled with the brass buttons of my sodden dress. I managed to change into the dry camise and flannel petticoat I'd brought, layering my damp cloak over them for what little warmth it might provide. The food I'd packed, bread, jerky, and dried apples, held no appeal, but I forced myself to eat, knowing I needed the strength. Wrapped in my relative cocoon of dryness, too exhausted to continue but too cold for sleep, I found myself doing what humans have done since the beginning of time when faced with the indifferent fury of nature. I prayed. "Lord," I whispered, my breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. "I'm not asking for myself, but for that innocent child. And for Jedediah, help him know he's worthy of your grace." The words emerged hoarsely, more desperate plea than formal prayer. I continued, my mind moving beyond the memorized phrases of Sunday worship to the raw truth of my heart. "You know, I've always tried to be good, to do what's expected. I've been the obedient daughter, the proper teacher, the patient woman who waits for a man to recognize his own worth." My voice broke on a sob that surprised me with its intensity. "But I cannot be patient any longer, not with Lily's life at stake, not with Jed determined to punish himself for sins you've already forgiven." The rain seemed to ease slightly, though perhaps it was only wishful thinking on my part. I leaned my head against the cold stone, feeling the last of my strength ebbing away. "Show me the way to him," I whispered. "Please, just show me the way." For long moments, nothing answered but the steady patter of rain and the mournful sigh of wind through pine boughs. My eyes drifted closed, my body surrendering to the weariness that pulled at every limb. A sudden shift in the quality of sound, some subtle change in the storm's rhythm, caused me to force my heavy eyelids open once more. At first, I saw only darkness, the same impenetrable black that had surrounded me for hours. Then, as my vision adjusted, I detected something different. A faint, wavering light in the distance, barely discernible through the veil of rain. I blinked, certain I was imagining it, a hallucination born of desperation and cold. But the light remained steady despite the storm's fury, a golden glow that could only be a lantern or a cabin window. Hope surged through me, lending strength to limbs I'd thought beyond movement. I gathered my belongings with trembling hands, securing the saddlebags across my back once more. Using the rocky wall for support, I pulled myself upright, wincing as blood flowed back into stiffened legs. "Thank you," I breathed, my eyes fixed on that distant beacon. "Thank you." Each step was agony, my sodden boots slipping on the rain-slickered ground, my body protesting movement after its brief respite. But the light grew steadily stronger, guiding me forward when the trail itself was invisible beneath the layer of mud and debris. As I drew closer, the vague outline of a cabin emerged from the darkness. A solid, square shape with a steep pitched roof, built to withstand the fierce mountain winters. Smoke curled from the stone chimney despite the rain, suggesting a fire within. And in one window, steady and unwavering, burned the lantern light that had been my salvation. I stumbled the final yards to the cabin door, my heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and trepidation. What if Jed turned me away? What if pride or shame or stubborn independence caused him to shut the door in my face? "Then I'll break it down," I whispered fiercely, raising my fist to knock. "I've come too far to be denied now." The sound of my knocking seemed feeble against the storm's roar, barely audible even to my own ears. I tried again, putting the last of my strength into pounding against the rough-hewn planks. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from within, came the scrape of a chair against floorboards, followed by heavy footsteps approaching the door. A bolt slid back, metal against metal, and the door swung inward, spilling golden lamplight and blessed warmth into the night. Jed stood framed in the doorway, his expression transforming from wariness to shock as he registered my presence. His mouth opened, but whatever words he might have spoken were lost as my knees finally buckled, my body surrendering now that its purpose had been fulfilled. The last thing I felt before darkness claimed me were strong arms catching me, lifting me from the cold and rain into warmth and light. into the home of the man who had walked away from me twice, but toward whom I had walked unflinching through storm and darkness and despair. I came to awareness gradually, my senses returning one by one. First came touch, the delicious warmth enveloping my body, so different from the bone-deep cold that had been my constant companion for hours. Then smell, wood smoke, coffee, and the familiar scent of saddle leather and pine that I'd always associated with Jed. Sound followed, the crackling of a robust fire, rain lashing against windows, the soft clink of metal against metal. Finally, I opened my eyes to find myself wrapped in quilts before a stone fireplace, my sodden clothing replaced by what appeared to be one of Jed's flannel shirts and a pair of woolen trousers rolled up at the ankles and cinched tight at the waist. "You're awake." I turned toward his voice, finding Jed kneeling beside me. His expression an unreadable mixture of concern, confusion, and something deeper I dared not name. In the firelight, the angles of his face seemed sharper than before, new lines etched around his eyes in the weeks since I'd last seen him. "Lily," I croaked, my voice raspy from cold and exhaustion. "The Harringtons." "Drink this first," he interrupted, pressing a steaming mug of coffee into my hands. "You're half frozen. Talk can wait until you're warmer." I shook my head, even as I gratefully accepted the mug, its heat seeping into my still trembling fingers. "It can't wait. They're not who they claim to be." Jed went still, his eyes narrowing. "What are you saying, Clara?" "They're frauds, criminals." The words tumbled out between chattering teeth as I struggled to sit straighter. "The Harringtons, they've done this before. In Sweetwater, in Laramie, they hunt for orphan children, forge documents claiming relation, and then—" I couldn't finish the thought, the horror of it stealing my breath. "Slow down," Jed said, though his voice had hardened to the dangerous edge I remembered from years ago, when he'd confronted a drunkard threatening women outside the church social. "Start from the beginning." I took another sip of coffee to steady myself, then told him everything. The traveling salesman's revelations, the telegrams confirming similar incidents in other settlements, the final damning evidence that Judge Hanson had been dead for 6 months. Sheriff Taylor wanted to organize a posse, I concluded, but the spring floods have washed out bridges along the eastern route. By the time they find an alternate path... I didn't need to complete the sentence. Jed was already on his feet, pacing the small confines of the cabin with the contained energy of a caged mountain lion. The transformation was startling. The somber, grief-stricken man who had ridden away from Timber Creek was gone, replaced by the ranger whose tracking skills were legendary throughout the territory. "They'll have taken the main stage route east toward Cheyenne," he said, his mind already plotting pursuit. "With the bridges out at Miller's Creek, they'll be forced north to the old Trapper's Trail that crosses at Widow's Ford." "Is that passable with this weather?" I asked, struggling to rise despite the weakness still pervading my limbs. "Barely, and only with the right guide." A humorless smile crossed his face. "Fortunately, I know every inch of that trail." He moved to a trunk in the corner, withdrawing oilskin ponchos, extra ammunition, and provisions with practiced efficiency. His actions were precise, focused, a man with purpose after days of aimless grief. "My horse went lame about 3 miles back," I said, watching him prepare. "I left her sheltered in a lean-to off the main trail. We'll need to retrieve her if possible." Jade paused in his preparations, turning to face me fully for the first time. Yes, we," I replied, lifting my chin despite the quilt still clutched around my shoulders. "I didn't nearly drown myself getting up this mountain just to sit here while you go after Lily alone. Clara, be reasonable," he began, using the tone one might employ with a particularly stubborn child. "The trails are treacherous, the weather's worsening, and you nearly collapsed from exhaustion just reaching my cabin." "And yet I did reach it," I countered, rising shakily to my feet. "When Sheriff Taylor said it couldn't be done. When everyone in Timber Creek thought I was mad for trying." Jed's expression softened marginally. "Why did you come yourself? Why not send someone else?" "Who would I send? Who else knows where your cabin is? Who else—" I broke off, steadying myself against a chair. "Who else cares for both you and Lily as I do?" Something flickered in his eyes at that. a vulnerability quickly masked by practical concerns. "You're still weak from the cold. You'll slow us down." "I'll keep up," I promised. "And you need me. You know these mountains better than anyone, but I know what the Harringtons look like, how they speak. I've seen their traveling coach, their belongings, details that could make all the difference when we're tracking them." Jed ran a hand through his hair in evident frustration, but I could see his resolve wavering. "It's too dangerous," he tried once more, though with less conviction. "More dangerous than letting Lily remain in the hands of people who traffic children?" I took a step toward him, steadier now. "More dangerous than facing the rest of our lives knowing we might have saved her but didn't try hard enough?" My emphasis on "our" wasn't lost on him. For a moment, I thought he might continue to argue, but instead, he turned back to his preparations, his silence a grudging concession. I moved to help him, my strength returning gradually as I sorted through supplies, selecting what would be essential for our journey. We worked in tense silence for several minutes, the only sounds the howling wind outside and the occasional clink of metal, as Jed checked and loaded his firearms. "If we find her," I said finally, unable to contain the question that had plagued me since his abrupt departure from Timber Creek, "what then, Jedediah?" He looked up, startled by the apparent change in subject. "What do you mean? Will you come back to Timber Creek? Will you raise her properly? Give her the home and family she deserves?" I took a steadying breath before adding, "Or will it be another goodbye when you decide you're unworthy? She deserves better than that, and so do I." My boldness surprised even me. But the past days had burned away my patience for half-truths and noble sacrifices. Jed went utterly still, his hands freezing in the act of rolling a blanket. "Clara, no," I interrupted, moving to stand before him. "I need to know before we ride out together. I need to know if we're fighting for the same future or if you'll walk away again the moment danger has passed." His eyes met mine, filled with a storm of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rough with feelings held too long in check. "The things I've seen, the things I've done." "Then help me understand," I challenged. "Tell me what's so terrible that it justifies abandoning those who love you." "Twice." The accusation hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. For a moment, I thought he might retreat behind the walls he'd maintained for so long. Instead, he sank onto a chair, his shoulders slumping as if under an invisible weight. "When I came back from the war," he began slowly, each word seeming to cost him dearly, "I believed God could never forgive what I'd done, the men I killed, some no more than boys, the things I saw that haunt my dreams still." His hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Then you loved me, and I couldn't reconcile how someone so good could love someone so damaged. It felt like a cruel joke, that I should find happiness when better men died in my place." The raw honesty of his confession struck deeper than any practiced speech could have. I moved to kneel before him, taking his clenched fists into my hands. "And so you decided for both of us," I said softly. "You decided I couldn't possibly understand the darkness you carried. You decided I deserved some imaginary perfect man instead of the real, wounded one I actually loved." His eyes met mine, startled by my framing of his actions. "I thought I was protecting you. From what? From loving a man who had seen the worst humanity offers and still retained enough goodness to worry about my happiness above his own?" I shook my head, my patience for his self-flagellation finally exhausted. "That's not protection, Jedediah. That's pride." He flinched as if struck, but I pressed on, determined to break through walls 5 years in the building. "Do you think you're the only one with darkness inside?" I asked. "The only one who's made mistakes? Who's failed to live up to God's perfect standard?" "Your mistakes couldn't possibly compare." "It's not a competition," I interrupted, my hands tightening on his. "God's grace isn't rationed out based on how little we've sinned. It's given freely, completely to all who ask." I released one of his hands to touch his face, turning it toward mine. "God doesn't love us because we're worthy, Jedediah. He makes us worthy because he loves us." Something broke in his expression then, some final resistance giving way before a truth too powerful to deny. He covered my hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "I've been a fool," he whispered. "Yes," I agreed, a smile tugging at my lips despite the gravity of the moment, "but a well-intentioned one." His free hand came up to cradle my face, mirroring my gesture. For a heartbeat we remained thus, balanced on the precipice of what might be, the storm raging outside, a pale echo of the emotions surging between us. "I don't deserve a second chance," he said, his voice barely audible, "much less a third. None of us deserves grace," I replied. "That's why it's amazing." The quotation from the beloved hymn seemed to touch something deep within him. Slowly, as if expecting me to pull away, he leaned forward until his forehead rested against mine. "If we find Lily," he said, his breath warm against my skin, "I want to bring her home. To Timber Creek. To—" He hesitated, then finished with quiet certainty. "To us, if you'll still have me." My heart swelled with emotions too complex for simple naming. Joy and fear and hope so intense it bordered on pain. "I've been waiting 5 years, Jedediah McKenzie," I whispered. "I think I can manage a few more days." I'm not certain which of us closed the final distance between us. Perhaps we moved together, drawn by the same invisible force that had bound us from our first meeting. His lips found mine with a reverence that made my breath catch, the kiss both achingly familiar and entirely new, an acknowledgement of all we had been to each other, and a promise of what we might yet become. When we finally parted, the cabin seemed transformed around us, no longer a solitary outpost, but the beginning of something shared, something built on stronger foundations than before. "We should go," Jed said reluctantly, though his hands lingered on my shoulders. "Every hour gives them more distance." I nodded, stepping back to gather my now dry cloak. "Your extra mount, will he carry double until we reach my mare?" "She's sturdy enough," Jed confirmed, donning his duster and hat. "And the trail widens after the first mile. We can make good time if the rain holds off." As if in answer, a fresh barrage of raindrops lashed against the cabin windows. I smiled ruefully. It seems the weather has other ideas. Jed surprised me with a smile of his own, small but genuine, the first I'd seen since Lily's departure. "Never known you to be deterred by a little rain, Clara Holloway." "Nor you by impossible odds, Ranger McKenzie," I returned, gathering the last of our supplies. Outside, the storm continued unabated, the darkness nearly absolute save for the lantern Jed held high as we made our way to the lean-to where his horses sheltered. The wind tore at our clothing, the rain stinging our faces like tiny needles of ice, but neither of us faltered. Somewhere ahead, through the storm and darkness, lay Lily, and with her, the future we had nearly lost to pride and fear. But this time we moved toward that future together, our separate paths finally converging into one. Chapter 7. Faith Rewarded. Dawn broke reluctantly over the eastern ridges, a pale, watery light seeping through clouds the color of wet slate. The rain had tapered to a fine mist that beaded on our oilskin ponchos and collected in the brim of Jed's hat before streaming down in rivulets. I clung to his waist as his sturdy mountain mare picked her way along a ribbon of trail that seemed, to my untrained eye, indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. We had retrieved my own horse, Penny, from the lean-to where I'd left her, but her injured leg made her unsuitable for riding. Jed had rigged a simple lead rope, allowing her to follow us at her own limping pace. The arrangement slowed our progress, but I'd refused to abandon her to the wilderness, and Jed hadn't pressed the issue. "How can you possibly track them in these conditions?" I asked, raising my voice to be heard over the constant drip of water from saturated pine boughs and the squelch of mud beneath the horse's hooves. The rain must have washed away any signs hours ago. Jed's back was warm against my chest, a stark contrast to the damp chill surrounding us. "Not tracking them directly," he replied, his voice a rumble I could feel through his coat. "Tracking where they had to go." He gestured toward what appeared, to my eyes, to be an unremarkable section of muddy trail. "See there? The stage route was washed out just beyond that granite outcropping. They'd have been forced to double back and take the northern fork toward Widow's Ford." I squinted at the scene, seeing nothing but soggy wilderness. "How can you be certain? Because there's only one other crossing within 30 miles, and it's through Devil's Canyon, he explained, urging his mount forward. No stage driver would attempt it even in fair weather, let alone during spring floods. My arms tightened involuntarily around his waist as the trail narrowed, a steep drop-off now visible to our right. We rode in silence for the next hour, the landscape gradually transforming around us. The dense pine forest thinned, giving way to more rugged terrain, jagged rock formations thrusting up from the earth like the spines of some enormous beast, sparse vegetation clinging tenaciously to crevices where soil had collected. By mid-morning, the mist had lifted enough to afford a view of the valley below, a patchwork of greening meadows, bisected by a swollen river that glinted dully in the intermittent sunlight. Jed reined in at a promontory, scanning the terrain with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years reading the wilderness as easily as I read books. "There," he said suddenly, pointing toward a distant thread of lighter brown against the valley floor. "The old Trapper's Trail. It follows the river for several miles before crossing at Widow's Ford." I leaned forward, my cheek nearly touching his shoulder as I strained to see. "Can you tell if they've passed this way?" "Not from here," he admitted. "But if they left Timber Creek when Clara said, and accounting for delays from the washouts, they should be approaching the ford by nightfall." "If we cut directly down through Miller's Pass," I suggested, recalling the maps I'd studied in Sheriff Taylor's office, "could we intercept them before they reach the crossing?" Jed turned slightly, surprise evident in his profile. "You know the territory better than I expected, schoolmarm." Despite our dire mission, I felt a small flame of pleasure at his acknowledgement. "I've been studying maps of Wyoming territory since I arrived 5 years ago," I admitted. "I find the landscape fascinating." Something that might have been a chuckle rumbled through his chest. "Miller's Pass it is, then. It'll be rough going, but you've proven you're tougher than you look." The compliment, plain and unadorned as it was, warmed me more than the finest poetry could have. We turned away from the promontory, following a barely discernible game trail that zigzagged down the steep eastern face of the mountain. The descent was treacherous, forcing Jed to dismount and lead his mare through the most precarious sections while I remained in the saddle, clinging to the pommel with white-knuckled determination. By mid-afternoon, we had reached the valley floor, where the going became somewhat easier. The rain had stopped entirely, though dark clouds still lurked on the western horizon, threatening more to come. We paused briefly to rest the horses and share a meager meal of jerky and hard biscuits, neither of us inclined to waste time with a proper fire. "Once we reach the main trail," Jed said as we remounted, my body protesting the return to the saddle after too brief a respite, "we should see sign of their passage if they came this way." I settled behind him once more, my arms encircling his waist in what had become a familiar position. "And if they didn't?" He was silent for a moment, his body tense against mine. "Then we've guessed wrong, and they've found another route east. But my instincts say this is the path they'd take, the only logical one given the conditions." We pushed onward, the miles passing in a blur of aching muscles and growing urgency as the afternoon waned. When we finally intersected with the wider Trapper's Trail Jed had pointed out from above, he dismounted immediately, scanning the muddy ground with singular focus. "Here," he called, kneeling beside what looked to me like nothing more than another patch of mud. "Coach wheels, heavy ones, with the left rear wheel showing excessive wear on the outer edge." Hope surged through me as I slid awkwardly from the saddle, my legs trembling beneath me as I moved to join him. "How recently?" Jed pressed his fingers into one of the ruts, measuring its depth and consistency. "Within the last few hours? The edges are still sharp, not yet softened by the damp." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "We're close, Clara." We remounted with renewed purpose, following the muddy track eastward as the valley narrowed gradually around us. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, with the trail hugging the base of cliffs on our left, while the swollen river churned along our right, its surface littered with debris from upstream branches, sections of fence, even what appeared to be part of a footbridge. The wheel ruts remained clear, despite occasional patches of standing water, testament to the weight of the coach that had carved them. As we rounded a sharp bend, Jed suddenly reined in so abruptly I nearly pitched forward against his back. "What is it?" I asked, peering around his shoulder. Before us, the trail split, the main path continuing to follow the river's meandering course, while a narrower track veered left into a steep-walled canyon barely wide enough for a coach to pass through. "They've taken the canyon route," Jed said, disbelief evident in his voice as he pointed to the clear wheel marks turning into the narrow defile. I frowned, studying the forbidding passage with its sheer rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. "Is that not the way to the ford?" "It's a shortcut of sorts," he explained, his expression grim. "Cuts off about 10 miles, but it's treacherous in the best conditions. The walls are unstable, prone to rock slides, and the floor of the canyon floods with even moderate rainfall." He shook his head in disbelief. "This shortcut is dangerous even in good weather. They're risking their lives. And Lily's." The thought of our sweet Lily in that deadly passage sent ice through my veins. Why would they take such a risk? "They're desperate," I reasoned after a moment's thought, recalling the evidence we had gathered. "The sheriff's telegrams will have lawmen looking at every major crossing. They must know they're being pursued by now." Jed nodded slowly, his jaw set in a hard line. "They're hoping to reach the railroad before word spreads. Once they're on a train east with forged papers, they'd be nearly impossible to track." A distant sound reached us then, a deep, ominous crack that echoed off the canyon walls like distant thunder. We both recognized it instantly for what it was, the sound of timber breaking under enormous strain. "The flash floods," Jed said, already spurring his mount forward. "The debris must have dammed part of the canyon. If it breaks loose while they're in there..." He didn't need to finish the thought. We both knew what such a torrent could do in the confined space of the narrow canyon. Without another word, he urged his horse into a gallop, hooves thundering against the muddy ground as we raced toward the canyon entrance. Penny struggled to keep pace behind us, her injury forcing her into an awkward three-legged lope. The walls of the canyon rose around us like the gates of some primeval fortress, cutting off much of the already dim afternoon light. The air grew noticeably cooler and damper, heavy with the scent of wet stone and the metallic tang of minerals leaching from the rock face. The trail narrowed further, forcing us to slow our pace despite the urgency driving us forward. The wheel ruts remained clearly visible, now joined by the distinctive prints of the coach horses, 8 hooves driving deep into the soft earth. They couldn't be more than an hour ahead of us, judging by the freshness of the tracks. Another crack reverberated through the canyon, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of rushing water. Jed pushed his mount harder, the animal sensing our urgency and responding with a burst of speed that sent mud flying from beneath her hooves. We rounded a sharp bend in the canyon to find the path ahead rising slightly, a natural bottleneck where the walls pinched inward to their narrowest point. Beyond it, I could just make out a wider section where the canyon floor dipped again, and there, stranded on a slight rise in the middle of what had become a rapidly filling basin, sat the Harringtons' coach. One of the wheels had sunk deep into the mud, tilting the entire vehicle at a precarious angle. The driver was in the water, which already reached his knees, struggling desperately with the harness of one of the lead horses while shouting instructions we couldn't hear over the roar of approaching water. "There!" I cried, pointing toward the coach. Through its window, I caught a glimpse of pale fabric and a flash of movement that could only be Victoria Harrington, and in her arms, my heart nearly stopped, the small bundle that had to be Lily. Jed had already seen them. With a sharp command that startled even me with its authority, he spurred his horse forward into the rising water, Penny forgotten as we raced against time and nature's fury to reach the 3 souls trapped in the canyon's deadly embrace. The canyon had become a maelstrom of noise and motion, rushing water, panicked horses, and human voices raised in desperate shouts. As we drew closer, I could see that what had initially appeared to be a simple case of a stuck wheel was far more dire. An enormous pine trunk, uprooted by the flooding upstream, had been swept down the canyon and now lay wedged against the coach's undercarriage, pinning it in place while water rose inexorably around it. Edward Harrington stood knee-deep in the swirling current, his fine city clothes sodden and mud-splattered, his hat long gone. He was struggling alongside the driver to free the lead horses from their traces before they drowned or panicked completely. The animals tossed their heads and rolled their eyes, whites showing in stark contrast to their dark coats as they fought against both harness and current. Through the coach window, I could see Victoria Harrington's pale face, her usual composure shattered by genuine terror. In her arms, Lily wailed with a volume that somehow carried above the water's roar, her tiny face bright red with distress. "The coach is shifting!" Jed shouted, pointing to where the rising water had begun to undermine the ground beneath the downhill wheels. "It won't hold much longer." He guided his horse to higher ground, helping me dismount before swinging down himself. "Stay here," he ordered, shrugging out of his duster and checking his pistol to ensure it hadn't been dampened. "I'm going to try to reach the coach before it slides further." "Jedediah, be careful," I called after him, but he was already moving, picking his way across a narrow strip of relatively dry ground that skirted the worst of the flooding. Edward Harrington spotted him almost immediately, his expression cycling rapidly from hope to recognition to fear. "Help us!" he shouted, apparently deciding that rescue trumped the risk of being caught. "The coach is going any minute." Jed ignored him, focusing instead on finding a path to the coach's door. The water had risen to mid-thigh now, its powerful current tugging at his legs with each step. A lesser man would have been swept away, but Jed moved with the sure-footed determination I'd always admired, testing each foothold before committing his weight. "Hurry, for God's sake!" Victoria Harrington's voice rang out from within the coach, all pretense of gentility abandoned in the face of mortal danger. Lily's cries had taken on a frantic quality that tore at my heart, the sound of a baby in genuine distress, not merely hungry or uncomfortable. I watched helplessly as Jed reached the coach door, pulling himself up on the handle to peer inside. The current chose that moment to surge, dislodging more earth from beneath the downhill wheels. The entire vehicle groaned and shifted several inches toward the deepest part of the flooded canyon. Victoria screamed, clutching Lily tighter as she braced herself against the opposite door. Jed clung to the handle, nearly pulled under by the sudden movement. From my vantage point, I could see what he could not: that Edward Harrington had abandoned the horses and was now wading toward the shore, leaving both his wife and Lily to their fate as he focused on saving himself. "You coward!" I shouted, rage burning through me at his betrayal. "Your wife and the baby are still inside." Whether he heard me or not, he didn't turn back. The driver, seeing his employer's retreat, had also abandoned the horses and was struggling toward higher ground on the opposite side of the canyon. A terrible cracking sound drew my attention back to the coach, where the wood around the hinges had begun to splinter under the strain of the vehicle's precarious angle. Jed had managed to wrench the door open and was reaching inside, saying something to Victoria I couldn't hear over the water's roar. I couldn't remain a passive observer any longer. Gathering my skirts, I made my way along the same narrow strip of higher ground Jed had used, my focus divided between watching my footing and keeping an eye on Edward Harrington, who had nearly reached the shore. If he escaped, all our efforts might be for nothing. Lily saved, but her kidnapper is free to prey on other children. "Stop him!" I shouted to Jed, pointing toward the fleeing man. "He's getting away!" Jed was fully occupied with trying to extract Lily from Victoria's grip, the woman apparently having second thoughts about relinquishing the child now that rescue seemed possible. I watched them struggle for a moment, then made a split-second decision that seemed to come from somewhere beyond conscious thought. "Mr. Harrington," I called out, forcing my voice into a tone of panicked desperation. "Help! Your wife is trapped. The door won't open." It was a blatant falsehood, but it had the desired effect. Victoria's head snapped toward the sound of my voice, her grip on Lily momentarily loosening. In that instant, Jed seized his opportunity, snatching Lily from her arms and backing away from the coach door. "No!" Victoria shrieked, lunging after him. "Give her back!" But it was too late. Jed had already closed the distance to higher ground, holding Lily tight against his chest as he waded through the churning water. The baby's cries had somehow intensified, her tiny body rigid with fear, but at least she was free of those who meant her harm. Edward Harrington, caught by my desperate plea, hesitated at the canyon's edge. I could see calculation in his eyes as he weighed his wife's life against his own safety. Whatever his decision might have been, Fate intervened. As he turned to look back at the coach, his expensive leather boots, made for city sidewalks, not canyon mud, slipped from under him, sending him sprawling into the soggy earth. I was on him before he could regain his footing. My months of chopping wood and carrying water giving me strength he clearly hadn't expected from a schoolteacher. I planted a knee firmly in the center of his back, pinning him in place as Jed had once shown me when demonstrating how lawmen subdued resistant prisoners. "Don't move," I hissed, all my fury at what this man had done not just to Lily, but to countless other children evident in my voice, "or so help me, I will personally ensure you never walk properly again." Whether it was my tone or the press of my knee against his spine, he went still beneath me, offering no resistance as I fumbled in my pocket for the length of cord I'd brought for just this purpose. A horrible grinding noise drew my attention back to the coach. The vehicle was tilting further, water now pouring in through the open door where Victoria Harrington clung to the frame, screaming for help that no one seemed inclined to offer. As if in slow motion, the remaining support beneath the downhill wheels gave way completely, and the coach slid sideways into deeper water. Victoria's screams cut off abruptly as she was thrown back inside by the sudden movement. The coach settled at a drunken angle, water now reaching the windows, but miraculously it didn't overturn completely. The fallen tree that had initially trapped them now provided an anchor of sorts, preventing the vehicle from being swept downstream. I turned my attention back to my captive, finishing the work of binding his hands behind his back with knots Jed had insisted I learned during our brief courtship 5 years ago. For a school teacher's safety, he'd said then. I'd never imagined using the skill like this, but I was profoundly grateful for it now. Jed had reached my side, his clothing soaked to the skin, his face set in grim lines of both triumph and concern. In his arms, Lily continued to wail, her little body shaking with the force of her distress. "Here," I said, reaching for her instinctively. "Let me." He transferred her carefully, his eyes never leaving Edward Harrington's prone form. "He secure?" "As a Christmas goose," I confirmed, cradling Lily close and turning slightly to shelter her from the wind that had picked up as the storm's remnants continued to churn above us. To my amazement, the moment Lily registered my face, her crying faltered. Her tiny hands reached up, grasping at my chin with surprising strength, her tear-filled eyes widening with what could only be recognition. "Hello, sweet girl," I whispered, pressing my lips to her forehead. "We've missed you so." As if those were the magic words she'd been waiting to hear, her rigid body relaxed against me, her sobs transforming into hiccuping breaths as she nestled into the familiar curve of my arms. I looked up to find Jed watching us, his expression softened by a wonder that matched my own. "She remembers," he said simply, the words carrying a wealth of meaning beyond their surface. I nodded, not trusting my voice as emotion threatened to overwhelm me. After everything, the desperate journey through the storm, the frantic pursuit, the dangerous rescue, here was Lily, safe in my arms, somehow knowing she belonged there, despite the days of separation. "God's timing is perfect, even in a storm," I whispered, more to myself than to Jed, but he nodded as if I'd voiced a profound truth. "What about the woman?" he asked, glancing toward the partially submerged coach where Victoria Harrington could be seen pressing against a window, her face a mask of fear and fury. "The water's not rising further," I observed, noting how the flood seemed to have reached its peak and even receded slightly in the time since we'd arrived. "She's not in immediate danger. Better to leave her there until the sheriff's posse arrives. Less chance of her escaping that way." Jed raised an eyebrow at my pragmatic assessment, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Clara Holloway, I do believe Wyoming has made you considerably less proper than when you first arrived from Boston." I matched his almost smile with one of my own. "Circumstances shape us all, Ranger McKenzie, and some circumstances require practicality over propriety." He sobered, looking from me to Lily, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against my shoulder, to our captive still lying face down in the mud. "We found her," he said softly, wonder threading through his voice. "Against all odds, we found her." "We did," I agreed, shifting Lily gently to free one hand which I extended to him. "Together." His fingers closed around mine, warm despite the cold water he'd waded through, strong despite the weariness I knew he must feel. Behind us, Victoria Harrington began shouting threats and imprecations that echoed off the canyon walls, but they seemed distant and meaningless compared to the solid reality of Jed's hand in mine and Lily's weight in my arms. The storm clouds had begun to break apart overhead, allowing thin shafts of sunlight to penetrate the canyon. One such beam illuminated the three of us, man, woman, and child, painting us in golden light that felt, in that moment, like a benediction. The return to Timber Creek had been arduous, but triumphant. Sheriff Taylor and his hastily assembled posse had intercepted us halfway back, having found an alternate route around the washed-out bridges. With extra horses and dry supplies, the journey became considerably less grueling, though I scarcely noticed physical discomforts. Lily was safe in my arms, and Jed rode beside us, his protective presence never wavering. Nothing else seemed to matter. 2 days later, I stood in Sheriff Taylor's office as he completed the paperwork that would ensure the Harringtons, or rather the Wells couple, as their true identity had been revealed, would face justice for their crimes. The small, sturdy building smelled of wood polish, leather, and the particular blend of pipe tobacco the sheriff favored, scents that now represented safety rather than danger. Samuel and Margaret Wells, Sheriff Taylor read from the telegram spread before him on his desk, wanted in Illinois, Missouri, and now Wyoming territory for child trafficking, forgery, and fraud. He shook his head, disgust evident in his expression. Been at it for nigh on 5 years, according to the federal marshal in St. Louis. Jed stood by the window, one shoulder propped against the frame as he kept watch on Lily, who was currently being fussed over by Mrs. Abernathy and half the Ladies' Aid Society in the street outside. The town had erupted in celebration upon our return, the story of the daring rescue growing more elaborate with each retelling. "How many children?" Jed asked, his voice tight with the same anger I still felt burning in my own chest. "At least 7 confirmed cases," the sheriff replied, rubbing his jaw wearily. "Possibly more. They targeted isolated settlements where communication between townships is limited, orphaned children with few connections, like Lily." "And what became of these children?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Sheriff Taylor's expression softened slightly as he glanced at me. "Sold, Ms. Holloway, to wealthy families back east seeking heirs but unwilling or unable to adopt through proper channels. Some may have landed in good homes despite the circumstances. Others—" He trailed off, the implication clear. A wave of nausea swept through me at the thought of what might have befallen Lily had we not discovered the truth in time. I moved to the barred door that separated the office from the 2 cells beyond, where Samuel and Margaret Wells were confined. They no longer resembled the elegant couple who had presented themselves as the Harringtons. Their fine clothes were mud-stained and rumpled, their carefully maintained veneer of gentility washed away like the canyon soil beneath the floodwaters. Samuel Wells sat on his cot with his back against the wall, his expression a mask of cold defiance. His wife in the adjoining cell paced like a caged animal, her once elaborate coiffure hanging in limp strands around her pale face. She paused when she noticed me watching, her eyes narrowing. "Come to gloat, Miss Holloway?" she asked, her voice hoarse from what I suspected had been hours of alternating between threats and pleas. "To judge us from your lofty moral perch?" "I came to understand," I replied simply. "Understand?" she laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. What could a prim schoolmistress possibly understand about our world? "Clara," Jed cautioned from across the room, clearly concerned about my proximity to the cells, "they don't deserve your consideration." I acknowledged his concern with a slight nod, but didn't retreat. Something about Margaret Wells's expression, a fleeting vulnerability beneath the bravado, held me in place. "How did it begin?" I asked her. "You weren't always this—" "Don't answer her, Margaret," Samuel snapped from his cell. "Nothing we say matters now." But Margaret seemed not to hear him, her eyes fixed on mine with sudden intensity. "Our son," she said, the words barely audible. "James. He was 3 when the fever took him, perfect in every way until he wasn't." Her hands gripped the iron bars, knuckles white with the force of her emotion. "Do you know what it's like to hold your child as the light leaves their eyes, Miss Holloway? To beg God for mercy that never comes?" I heard Jed shift behind me, doubtless uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but I kept my gaze steady on Margaret's face. Is that when you began taking other people's children? To replace the one you lost? We began by helping, she insisted, a hint of desperate justification in her tone, finding homes for genuine orphans, connecting childless couples with children who needed families. But the gratitude, the rewards were so meager compared to what the wealthy would pay. Her voice hardened. Money opens doors, provides security. After James, I needed security. So you started forging documents, I said, claiming blood relation to children who had no one to contradict you. She didn't deny it, her silence confirmation enough. From his cell, Samuel made a disgusted sound. Enough, Margaret, she's baiting you into a confession. I ignored him, focusing on the woman before me, seeing beneath her criminal actions to the broken mother who had allowed grief to twist into something monstrous. The children you took, I said gently, did you ever think about what they suffered, being torn from everything familiar, everyone who cared for them? A flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, crossed Margaret's face before she could master it. They were young, children adapt. They would have had advantages, opportunities. They would have had lies, I interrupted, my voice firm but not unkind. A foundation built on deception and purchase, not love. To my surprise, Margaret's carefully maintained facade crumbled. She sank to her knees, still clutching the bars, as tears began to stream down her face. I just wanted to stop the pain, she whispered, to fill the emptiness James left behind. But it never worked. Each child we took only reminded me more of what I'd lost. I knelt to her level, close enough to see the fine lines around her eyes, the ravages of grief beneath the criminal. Your pain doesn't justify causing pain to others, I told her gently. But God's forgiveness reaches even into jail cells when truly sought. She stared at me, momentarily speechless, before a bitter laugh escaped her. God abandoned me when he took my son. What use have I for his forgiveness now? The same use we all have, I replied simply. The chance to begin again, however confined our circumstances. I glanced toward Samuel, who had turned his back to us, his rigid posture expressing clear disdain for his wife's emotional display. Not all prisons have iron bars, Mrs. Wells. Something in my words seemed to reach her. Her grip on the bars loosened slightly, her shoulders slumping as if a great weight had settled more firmly upon them. The little girl, Lily, she said hesitantly. She's home, I answered, rising to my feet, where she belongs. Margaret nodded once, then retreated to her cot, her moment of vulnerability passing as she wrapped her arms around herself in a gesture that spoke of both self-protection and profound loneliness. I turned away from the cells to find both Sheriff Taylor and Jed watching me with remarkably similar expressions of bewilderment. Circuit Judge arrives next week, the sheriff said, clearing his throat. They'll likely be transported to Cheyenne to stand trial, federal charges given they cross state lines. I nodded, suddenly eager to be outside in the spring sunshine, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the jail cells. What will happen to them? Prison, most likely, Sheriff Taylor replied. For a considerable time, given the nature and extent of their crimes. Could have been worse for them, Jed observed, his expression unreadable. Frontier justice isn't always delivered in a courtroom. I understood his meaning. Had the town discovered the true nature of the Wells activities while they still had Lily, mob justice might well have prevailed over legal procedures. The thought sent a shiver through me despite the warmth of the office. If you're finished here, Miss Holloway, Sheriff Taylor said, I believe there's a celebration beginning outside that won't properly start without the heroines of the hour. I mustered a smile at his kind exaggeration of my role and allowed Jed to escort me outside, his hand settling at the small of my back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive in the most welcome way. The main street of Timber Creek had been transformed in our brief absence. Bunting draped from buildings, tables laden with food stretched before the church, and it seemed every resident for miles around had gathered to celebrate Lily's safe return. Mrs. Abernathy had taken temporary charge of her, showing her off to the assembled townsfolk like a proud grandmother. Quite a homecoming, Jed observed as we paused on the jailhouse steps, surveying the festive scene. For all of us, I agreed, watching as Pastor Wells moved through the crowd, stopping to speak with various groups, and likely reminding them that the celebration should include appropriate thanksgiving for divine intervention. Jed turned to face me directly, his eyes more open and unguarded than I'd ever seen them. "What you did in there," he said, nodding toward the jail behind us with Margaret Wells, "after everything they put us through, put Lily through, I don't know that I could have found that kind of compassion." I considered his words thoughtfully. Compassion doesn't mean excusing what they did, I clarified. Justice still matters, but seeing the humanity in even those who have done terrible things, that's what separates civilization from barbarism, I think. "Your capacity for mercy humbles me," he said softly, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from my cheek with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "It's one of the countless reasons I love you." The declaration, spoken so simply in the afternoon sunlight, with the sounds of celebration surrounding us, filled me with a joy so profound it momentarily robbed me of speech. Jed McKenzie was not a man who spoke of love lightly or often. That he chose this moment, this place, to voice what I'd seen growing in his eyes since our reconciliation in the storm-lashed cabin felt like the closing of a circle begun 5 years before. "Countless reasons," I managed finally, happiness making me almost lightheaded. "I believe I'd like to hear the others, Ranger McKenzie." A smile spread across his face. Not the guarded half-smile I'd grown accustomed to, but the full, unrestrained expression that transformed his features and made my heart race like a schoolgirl's. "I reckon I have a lifetime to enumerate them," he replied, offering me his arm. "If you're willing to listen that long." "I believe I could make the time," I said, slipping my hand through his elbow as we descended the steps toward the celebration, toward Lily, toward the townspeople who had become family, toward the future that stretched before us, no longer separate paths but a single road traveled together. The oak tree stood on a gentle rise at the edge of town, its massive branches spreading like a protective canopy over the spot where Jed and I had spent countless evenings during our first courtship. 5 years had added new rings to its trunk, weathered its bark to a deeper silver gray, but otherwise the tree remained unchanged, a steadfast witness to both heartbreak and hope. The celebration of Lily's return had gradually dispersed as afternoons stretched toward evening, families returning to homes and chores too long neglected. Jed had suggested a walk to stretch our legs after so many hours of socializing. Lily balanced on his hip as naturally as if she'd been there all her life. I'd agreed readily, weary of being the center of attention and craving quieter moments with the two people who had, in such a short time, become the center of my world. Now, with the late May sun slanting golden through the oak's new leaves, I settled on the patchwork quilt Jed had brought along, watching as Lily crawled enthusiastically after a butterfly flitting through the grass. Her determination and focus reminded me so much of Jed that I couldn't help smiling, despite the lingering exhaustion from our ordeal. "She's recovered quickly," I observed as Jed lowered himself beside me, his ranger's keen eyes never leaving Lily's exploring form, and would hardly know she'd been through such an ordeal. "Children are resilient," he agreed, reaching into his pocket for the wooden horse he'd carved during the winter evenings. He placed it in Lily's path, drawing her attention from the elusive butterfly. She seized it with a delighted gurgle, immediately bringing it to her mouth for a thorough investigation. I leaned back on my hands, tilting my face to catch the warmth of the fading sunlight. "The entire town has fallen in love with her. Mrs. Abernathy is already planning her first birthday celebration, and it's months away. Speaking of planning," Jed said, his tone shifting to something that immediately caught my attention, "I've been giving considerable thought to our future arrangements." I turned to look at him more directly, noting the unusual tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers worked nervously at a blade of grass. "Oh," he nodded, his gaze fixed on Lily, who had settled contentedly on her stomach, making the wooden horse gallop across the quilt with surprising dexterity for one so young. "The Jensen house suits us well enough for now, but it was never meant as a permanent home." My heart quickened at the implication in his words. "And you're thinking of something more permanent?" Instead of answering directly, Jed reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, handling it with a care that suggested its contents were precious. "Do you remember the Carson place, about 3 miles east of town, near Cottonwood Creek?" I nodded, recalling the small but well-built homestead that had stood empty since old Mr. Carson had passed away the previous autumn. "The property with the apple orchard and the view of the eastern mountains?" "The very same." Jed opened the envelope and removed a folded document, his fingers uncharacteristically hesitant. "I purchased it last week. The deed was recorded yesterday." Surprise rendered me momentarily speechless. In all our discussions since Lily's rescue, we had spoken in generalities about the future, both understanding that something had fundamentally changed between us, but neither rushing to define its exact nature. "It's a good location," Jed continued, seeming to take my silence as disappointment. "Close enough to town for your teaching, but with enough land for a garden and livestock. The house needs work, but the bones are solid, and it's positioned such that I can maintain my ranger duties while still coming home most evenings. You've thought this through quite thoroughly," I managed, my voice not entirely steady as hope began to bloom within me. "I have." He set the deed aside and rose to his feet, surprising me by extending his hand to help me up as well. Even more surprising was when, once I stood before him, he lowered himself to one knee, his expression more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. "Jedediah," I breathed, my hand flying to my throat as understanding dawned. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object that caught the golden light. A ring. Simple but elegant, a gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. The sight of it struck me with the force of memory. "That's your mother's ring," I whispered, recognizing the piece of jewelry he had shown me once long ago, explaining it was the only thing of value his father had ever managed to give his beloved wife. "It is," he confirmed, holding it between us like an offering. But it wasn't only the ring he presented. In his other hand, he still held the deed to the Carson property. "I'm not a man of grand gestures or flowery words, Clara, but I am a man who has learned the hard way what truly matters in this life." Lily, as if sensing the significance of the moment, had gone quiet, watching us with solemn blue eyes, the wooden horse clutched forgotten in her tiny fist. "5 years ago, I walked away from the greatest blessing God ever gave me," Jed continued, his voice steady with certainty despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I've spent every day since then learning that His grace is bigger than my failures. If you'll have me, Clara Holloway, I promise to spend the rest of my days thanking Him and you for this second chance." Tears blurred my vision, but I made no move to wipe them away, wanting nothing to diminish this perfect moment beneath the oak tree that had witnessed both our beginning and our parting. "I don't need grand gestures or flowery words," I said, my voice trembling with joy. "I just need you, Jedediah McKenzie, you and Lily and whatever life the Lord sees fit to bless us with, be it grand or humble." I extended my left hand, which shook slightly as Jed slipped the ring onto my finger. It fit as if it had been made for me, the pearl gleaming softly in the late afternoon light. Jed rose to his feet, gathering both my hands in his, the deed to our future home pressed between our palms. "Is that a yes, Clara Holloway?" he asked, a smile breaking across his face like sunrise over the mountains. "Yes," I laughed through my tears. 1,000 times yes. The sound of enthusiastic clapping startled us both. We turned to find Pastor Wells standing a short distance away, his round face beaming with satisfaction, his Bible tucked under one arm. Beside him stood Mrs. Abernathy, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Sheriff Taylor, looking uncharacteristically sentimental. "I do apologize for the intrusion," Pastor Wells said, not appearing remotely sorry. "But Mrs. Abernathy was most insistent that we check on Lily's welfare after her ordeal. Pure coincidence that we happened upon such a momentous occasion." The gleam in his eye suggested nothing of the sort, but I found I didn't mind the audience. Our story had always belonged partly to this community that had supported us, prayed for us, and now celebrated with us. "A fortunate coincidence indeed," Jed remarked dryly, though his smile remained undimmed as he bent to scoop up Lily, who reached immediately for the shiny new ring on my finger. "Not coincidence," Pastor Wells corrected, approaching to clasp Jed's shoulder warmly. "Providence, my boy. I've been praying for this reunion since you first rode out of town 5 years ago, absolutely confident that God would complete the good work he had begun in both your hearts. You knew better than we did, it seems, I observed, my heart too full of joy to feel any embarrassment. Sometimes those closest to a situation have the least clarity about it, the pastor replied with a wink. Now, shall we discuss wedding arrangements? I have an opening in my schedule a week from Saturday. A week? Mrs. Abernathy exclaimed, horrified. Pastor Wells, really? There are preparations to be made, a dress to be sewn, a proper celebration to be arranged. These young people have waited 5 years. Surely they can manage another month or two. I looked at Jed, a question in my eyes. He answered with a gentle squeeze of my hand. A month, then, I suggested, my practical nature asserting itself through the haze of happiness. Time enough for modest preparations, but not so long that Lily might forget again who her family truly is. Family, Jed repeated, the word carrying a weight of meaning I understood completely. For a man who had lost his parents young, who had been estranged from his only brother, who had held himself apart from connection for so long, the concept of family was at once terrifying and precious beyond measure. Lily babbled something unintelligible, patting Jed's cheek with her small hand as if in affirmation. The gesture brought a suspicious brightness to his eyes, though he masked it quickly with a gruff clearing of his throat. A month it is, he agreed. Provided we can convince Mrs. Abernathy to limit the celebrations to something less than a territorial fair. The lady in question huffed indignantly, but her eyes sparkled with good humor. I make no promises, Ranger McKenzie. Some occasions deserve all the fanfare we can muster. As the others fell into animated discussion about wedding details, I leaned against Jed's shoulder, my heart fuller than I had ever imagined possible. The simple pearl ring on my finger caught the light as I reached to smooth Lily's wayward curls, the three of us framed by the spreading branches of the oak that had witnessed both endings and beginning. Thank you. Jed murmured, his words meant for my ears alone. For what? I asked, tilting my face up to his. For not giving up? For having the courage to climb a mountain in a storm to knock some sense into a stubborn ranger? His eyes, clear and unguarded, held mine with an intensity that still made my breath catch. For showing me that some blessings are worth fighting for, no matter how unworthy we might feel of receiving them. I thought of all we had endured to reach this moment. The years of separation, the brief joy of finding Lily, the devastation of losing her, the desperate pursuit through flood and storm, and finally the miraculous reunion that had led us here, beneath the oak tree where our story had begun. Some journeys take longer than others, I replied softly, but the destination is sweeter for the difficulties of the path. As the sun dipped toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Jed leaned down to press a kiss to my lips, a promise made without words, a covenant sealed beneath the watching sky. And Lily, nestled between us, reached up to grasp a finger from each of us in her tiny hands, completing the circle of family that had been formed not by blood alone, but by choice, by faith, and by love that had proven stronger than pride or fear or time itself. Timber Creek's white clapboard church had never looked so beautiful. Wildflowers spilled from every corner. Purple lupins, golden buttercups, and delicate columbines, gathered by the school children from the surrounding meadows and arranged with loving care. Sunlight streamed through the simple stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the plank floor, where so many of the town's significant moments had been witnessed over the years. I stood in the small anteroom, my hands trembling slightly as I smoothed the skirts of my gown, ivory silk trimmed with Belgian lace that Mrs. Abernathy had insisted on ordering from Denver, declaring that a bride should have at least one extravagance. The dress was far finer than I had imagined for myself, with its modest train and fitted bodice, yet it seemed right for this day that represented not just a wedding, but a resurrection of hope I had nearly abandoned. "You look beautiful, dear," Miss Agnes Hargrave said, adjusting the sprig of baby's breath in my carefully arranged hair. Her sister Esther, holding Lily on her hip, nodded emphatic agreement. "Like an angel," she declared. Doesn't she, Lily? Doesn't Miss Clara look just like an angel?" Lily, resplendent in a dress of pale blue that matched her eyes, reached for me with impatient hands. The tiny crown of daisies I had woven for her that morning sat slightly askew on her dark gold curls, giving her the appearance of a particularly mischievous fairy. "Careful now," Miss Agnes cautioned as I gathered Lily into my arms, mindful of my dress. "Mustn't muss you before the ceremony." "A few wrinkles would hardly be noticed," I replied, pressing my cheek against Lily's soft hair, drawing strength from her solid warmth. "Not when I have such a treasure to show for them." The sisters exchanged knowing glances, they who had never married but had mothered half the town's children through illnesses and heartbreaks over the decades. A gentle knock at the door preceded Sheriff Taylor's entrance. He had arrived in his Sunday best, his usually stern countenance softened by the occasion. "It's time, Miss Holloway," he said, offering his arm with formal courtesy. "That is, if you're still certain about this business." I laughed, recognizing his gruff attempt at humor. With no father to give me away, the sheriff had volunteered for the duty, declaring it only fitting since he'd had a hand in bringing us together. That his hand had consisted mainly of skepticism regarding my plan to reach Jed's cabin went tactfully unmentioned. "I've never been more certain of anything, Sheriff," I assured him, transferring Lily back to Miss Esther's waiting arms. The elderly woman would bring her forward at the appointed moment in the ceremony, a plan designed by Pastor Wells to symbolize the family we were forming this day. As the first notes of the organ filled the small church, I took a steadying breath and placed my hand on Sheriff Taylor's arm. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and for a moment I could see nothing beyond the sea of familiar faces, turned expectantly toward me. Mrs. Abernathy dabbing at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief, my students grinning with undisguised excitement, ranchers and shopkeepers and all the souls who made up our small community. Then my vision cleared, and I saw only Jed. He stood tall before the altar, his ranger uniform replaced by a new suit of charcoal gray that couldn't quite disguise the breadth of his shoulders or the strength in his stance. His hair had been freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, yet it was his expression that caught and held me. Naked joy mingled with a reverence that made my heart swell until I thought it might burst from my chest. The walk down the aisle passed in a blur of smiling faces and whispered blessings. Then Sheriff Taylor was placing my hand in Jed's, his callous fingers closing around mine with gentle strength, anchoring me as Pastor Wells began the ceremony that would join our lives formally before God and community. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began, his resonant voice filling the small church, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and this company to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, and to witness the formation of a family bound not just by law or blood, but by the deeper bonds of choice and love." Jed's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around mine at these words. I glanced up to find his eyes suspiciously bright as he returned my gaze with unwavering steadiness. The ceremony proceeded with the timeless exchange of promises. To love, honor, and cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death should part us. Words spoken by countless couples throughout history, yet in that moment, they felt newborn, crafted especially for us who had learned the hard way the true weight and meaning of such vows. When the time came to exchange rings, Jed's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the simple gold band alongside his mother's pearl ring, which I had worn since his proposal. I steadied his fingers with my own as I placed his ring, a plain gold band purchased with my teaching savings, onto his work-roughened hand. Then came the moment we had planned so carefully. At Pastor Wells' signal, Miss Esther stepped forward with Lily, who immediately reached for both of us. Jed lifted her into his arms, settling her between us as the pastor addressed the congregation. "Today we witness not only the union of man and wife, but the creation of a family," he said, his smile encompassing all three of us. "Jedediah and Clara have prepared special promises to Lily, acknowledging the sacred trust God has placed in their care." Jed cleared his throat, his voice emerging steady and clear despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Lily McKenzie, I promise to be a father to you in every way that matters, to protect you, to guide you, to teach you about your papa Matthew and your mama Sarah, who loved you from the moment they knew of you. I promise to cherish you as my own child all the days of my life and to strive to be worthy of the trust God has placed in me through your care." Tears blurred my vision as I spoke my own promises. "Lily, I promise to be a mother to you in heart and deed, if not in blood. To nurture your spirit as well as your body, to champion your dreams, to help you grow into the woman God created you to be. I promise to honor the memory of those who gave you life while embracing the blessing of raising you as my own daughter." Pastor Wells placed his hands over ours where they joined around Lily, who watched the proceedings with solemn interest, occasionally reaching to touch the tears on my cheeks with curious fingers. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the pastor declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife and family. You may kiss your bride, Jedediah." Jed leaned forward, Lily secure between us, and pressed his lips to mine in a kiss that held all the promise of our future and the healing of our past. When we parted, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers that startled Lily into wide-eyed wonder before she joined in with enthusiastic babbling of her own. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor Wells announced above the celebration, "it is my great pleasure to present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jedediah McKenzie and their daughter Lily." The remainder of the ceremony passed in a whirl of congratulations and well wishes as we made our way back down the aisle and out into the June sunshine. To our surprise, the churchyard stood empty, save for a ribbon-becked path that led toward the edge of town. "This way, if you please," Mrs. Abernathy directed, her expression betraying barely contained excitement. "There's a small gathering prepared in your honor." The small gathering proved to be anything but. As we followed the ribbon path, we found ourselves approaching the great oak tree where Jed had proposed, only now the area beneath its spreading branches had been transformed. Paper lanterns hung from the lower limbs, tables laden with food stretched in a half circle around a space cleared for dancing, and it seemed the entire population of Timber Creek and the surrounding homesteads had gathered to celebrate our union. "Surprised?" Sheriff Taylor asked with uncharacteristic smugness as we took in the festive scene. "Mrs. Abernathy's been organizing this for weeks, said a wedding this long in the making deserved a proper celebration." "It's perfect," I managed, overwhelmed by the tangible evidence of how deeply our community had invested in our happiness. The afternoon flowed into evening as we shared a feast that showcased the best offerings of every household in the area. Mrs. Jensen's famous fried chicken, the Wilkinsons' berry pies, Mr. Fletcher's homebrewed cider that packed a surprising punch. Lily was passed from lap to admiring lap, showered with affection and small gifts, her crown of daisies gradually wilting but still charming atop her curls. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western peaks, casting long golden shadows across the gathering, the Thompsons brothers unpacked their fiddles. The first notes of a lively reel cut through the evening air, and couples began moving toward the cleared space beneath the oak. To my surprise, Jed rose from his seat beside me and extended his hand. "Mrs. McKenzie," he said, his voice caressing the new name in a way that sent a pleasant shiver down my spine. "Might I have the honor of this dance?" "But you don't dance," I replied, remembering how he had steadfastly refused to join in the socials during our first courtship, claiming a soldier's stiffness and a ranger's dignity. "I've learned that some occasions merit setting aside old habits," he answered, his smile holding a warmth I was still growing accustomed to seeing so openly displayed. "Besides, I've been practicing." "Practicing?" I allowed him to draw me to my feet, intrigued by this revelation. "With Mrs. Abernathy," he admitted, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "She's surprisingly light on her feet for a woman of her substantial presence." The mental image this conjured, my tall, serious ranger being instructed in dance steps by the enthusiastic shopkeeper's wife, startled a laugh from me as Jed led me to the center of the gathering. With unexpected grace, he swept me into the dance, his arm secure around my waist as we moved among the other couples to the fiddle's joyful tune. From her perch on Mrs. Abernathy's ample lap at the edge of the dancing area, Lily clapped her hands delightedly, her expression one of pure joy as she watched us whirl past. The sight of her happiness coming after all she had endured filled my heart to overflowing. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" I asked Jed, breathless from dancing as the music drew to a close. Around us, friends and neighbors continued celebrating, their faces flushed with exertion and happiness on our behalf. Jed's answering smile held no trace of his former shadows, the haunted look that had once defined him, now replaced by a serenity I had never thought to see in this lifetime. "No," he admitted, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear with tender familiarity. "But God did, and His plans are always better than our fears." The simple truth of his words settled over me like a benediction. As the next dance began, Jed drew me closer, his strength and steadiness surrounding me like a harbor after long years at sea. Above us, the oak trees' leaves rustled in the gentle evening breeze, witnesses to a journey completed and another just beginning. Had anyone viewed our celebration from above in that moment, they would have seen a scene of perfect contentment, a dancing couple beneath an old oak now coming into its summer fullness, surrounded by a community that had held space for their return to one another. Beyond the gathering, the vast Wyoming landscape stretched toward mountains painted in hues of rose and amber by the setting sun, a reminder of the wildness and beauty that had shaped us all. And at the center, three souls bound together not by circumstance or obligation, but by choice and love and faith rewarded. A ranger who had found his way home at last, a schoolteacher who had never stopped believing in second chances, and a child who had brought them back to each other against all odds. Not an ending at all, I realized as I rested my head against Jed's shoulder, but the most beautiful of beginnings. The end.